Hi, my name is Murphy Griffin, and welcome to episode 21 of Neophyte Boatwrights. This episode's all about steam bending the ribs into my boat, so let's get to it. Alright, so there's a fair amount to cover in this episode, so here's the agenda. I'm going to start with discussing building a steam box for the build, going over the particulars of the construction and some of the ins and outs there. I'm also going to discuss material preparation and grain orientation for steam bending and what my research and experience has yielded in regards to best practices there. And then finally, we're going to look at steam bending the frames into my boat and whatever challenges I encountered along the way. So that about sums it up. So let's check out the steam box. So the steam box design is pretty simple. It's a 1x1 by 8 foot long box. I opted for Craig hole joinery because it's quick and simple and I've got the whole kit ready to go. It's wise to use fasteners instead of glue for a steam box because the steam and the heat will ultimately break down whatever adhesive you use unless maybe you're using epoxy. The good thing about screws though is that you can reuse them once the steam box bites the dust, but epoxy you can never get back. Going the way that the rest of them did. On broken blossom and nobody's child. I bought 2 steamers that are commercially available on Amazon that come with the hoses and hardware that you need. So this was a very simple install. The steamers are essentially wallpaper steamers, but they are marketed for wood bending purposes. Of course, the steam box needs doors. The hinges are basic hinges that you can get at the hardware store. I did, however, have to hunt down these special latches that make it easy to open and close the door tightly. Finally, I added these dowel rods along the length of the steam box that serve as a shelf to elevate the wood. So there's nothing really revolutionary here. It's the basic 101 dimensioning of timber. Planing wood to thickness and cutting it to size. But I do think it's important to appreciate just how much work goes into material preparation. While my jointer was on the fritz, I decided to take the matter literally into my own hands and flatten all the stock for the frames using a jointer plane. I've found that if there's a lot of variation in flatness on a particular piece, it can oftentimes be easier to use a hand plane than take it to the jointer. Once the pieces were planed and jointed, I could finally cut them down to size. The final dimensions for my frames were a 1/2 inch thick by 1 inch wide, and I cut some long ones at 8 foot long and then a batch of short ones at about 4 foot long. But there's one important matter I haven't discussed yet, and that's grain orientation. So one of the more contentious issues when it comes to bending wood is how to best orient the grain of the wood relative to how you're bending it to get the best results. There are essentially 2 options. Either the grain lines are perpendicular to the bend or they're parallel to the bend. I'm sure some of you watching may disagree with my take on this, but here we go. So if you think of a piece of wood as having a sort of sedimentary structure, like a layered cake, then you can think of each grain line as one piece of wood in a stack. Now, it's sort of common sense that if a piece of wood has a rectangular cross-section, like this piece of wood, then if I try to bend it perpendicular to the broad face, it'll bend more easily than if I try to bend it edgewise. That's because it's thicker in this dimension and thinner in that dimension. So a thinner piece of wood should technically bend easier. So approaching the grain orientation question naively, if I orient the grain of the piece of wood, especially if I have a rectangular piece of wood, so that the grain lines are parallel to the bend, then for each given layer, I'm bending a thinner piece of wood than I would if I had oriented it the other way. That being said, you're not always lucky enough to get the grain orientation perfect for your particular application. And more often than not, it's going to be a skew, somewhere between being perpendicular and parallel to the bend. So you see here, the piece of wood is rectangular in cross-section, and the grain is almost perpendicular to the bend, but it's a skew. So this is, in my mind, less ideal than if the grain lines were parallel. Nevertheless, even though the grain is skewed so that it's slightly perpendicular and slightly parallel to the bend, I did get a pretty decent bend out of this piece of wood. So long story short, there is no absolute answer. Of course, the first question is, how long should you steam a piece of wood to bend it? General wisdom is that you should steam a piece of wood for an hour for every inch of thickness. That being said, for all my half-inch thick ribs, I steam them for at least an hour, and in some cases longer. I didn't notice any ill effect from steaming the ribs for longer than an hour. No higher likelihood of breakage, drying out, nothing like that. We did experience a few failures along the way, but more often than not, this was because there was some interior defect to the piece of wood that I didn't notice when I was cutting it out. Truth be told, I was pretty concerned about bending failures when I first started. I even tried experimenting with soaking and boiling versus just steaming dried wood, but I didn't notice any benefit. Out of the over 20 ribs that we installed, we only had about 4 breakages along the way. And this is just straight steaming, air-dried oak. No boiling, no soaking, no preparation other than steaming. So take that for whatever it's worth. So it took us the first day of steaming to get all these initial half ribs installed midships, which includes riveting. Other than the half ribs around midships, there are also half ribs forward and aft. These ribs, however, are even trickier to install. But once we started installing full-length ribs, then we are really cooking with gas. The full-length ribs are pinned to the keel with holdfast nails. With all the forward ribs bent in, we turned now to the aft portion of the boat. Here there was a similar arrangement of full-length ribs and then half ribs. So something we discovered with the forward and aftmost full-length ribs is that they had to be pre-bent. So before Dale hands me the rib in the boat, he pre-bends it with his foot on the ground. This is just done in the very middle of the rib, where there's a lot of bend. We learned this lesson the hard way with one of our few failures. And in this case, this was really a failure of technique and not a defect in the wood. But the pre-bending was just the ticket. There was yet another challenge to the aftmost ribs, which is that the curvature was so pronounced in the back part of the boat that there was no way to really get the rib to hug the boat without using a lot of clamps. So above my head in the shot here, I have framed out a setup that will allow me to use long bar clamps to push the ribs down on the boat. I borrowed the idea from luthiers who use go bars to clamp odd-shaped objects together for glue-ups. Of course, all the ribs have to be fastened to the boat. This is done using the same riveting process that I describe in episode 17. Drill a pilot hole, clip the nail, install the rove, and then peen. Now you just have to do it 1,000 more times. Riveting the ribs is really a two-person process. You need someone bucking the head of the nail while you peen. The other important aspect is making sure that you're drilling at the right angle. So here you see Dale holding up a combination square on the plank above where I'm attaching to give me a reference for the drill angle. So one last bit of advice. You may have noticed that in a number of these shots I'm wearing knee pads. Honestly, I can't recommend knee pads enough. You're going to be in some really weird tight spots, bending over, and they make your life so much better. Once all the ribs have been riveted to the boat, you can trim off the excess. This really is a deeply enjoyable part of the process. Having trimmed down the tops of all the ribs, I can finally take a step back and appreciate the shape of the boat. Alright, so that's it for episode 21. I really hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the next episode, which will be covering the installation of the shear structure. So that includes the quarter knees, breast hook, in whales, and out whales. Also, don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to this channel, and if you're so inclined, please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon. With that said, I want to give a couple shout outs. First to the very mysterious Jay, who is my newest patron. Secondly, I want to give a massive shout out to Dale Winling. Dale is a history professor at Virginia Tech who got hip to my channel, reached out, and asked if he could come give me a hand. So you saw Dale a few times in the video helping me install about 75% of the ribs into the boat. Coincidentally, Dale's also making a YouTube channel documenting a boat build. He's building a Haven 12.5 and he's documenting it on his channel, Nettlesome Boat Shop. I'll add a link in the description to this video. So big shout out to Jay and Dale. Thank you very, very much. All right, until next time, bye.
Ow.